It's good to be with you today to talk about the important but very challenging issues of providing care for people affected by the war in Ukraine. I'm a psychiatrist and family physician, and I appreciate that it can be very challenging for primary care providers and neurologists and others to care for both the medical needs as well as the mental health care issues of their patients. I also want to recognize right up front that everything you're doing to care for patients is happening in the context of your own personal challenges during this war, which may involve ongoing feelings of being unsafe, loss of your home, displacement, the death of loved ones, and many other difficulties. So when we talk about taking care of patients, it's important that we also consider how to care for the well-being of physicians and other healthcare providers. These are my thoughts and ideas, and I have no disclosures or conflicts of interest to report. These are the objectives that I have for this talk. We'll review psychological and behavioral impacts of war and other disasters, risk and resilience factors, and a framework for interventions to protect mental health and of community members, and actions also to protect patients and providers in order to foster sustainment during a prolonged crisis event. Historically, in nearly all disasters, whether it's a war, a hurricane, industrial accident, or a pandemic, the psychological and behavioral impacts are the most far-reaching and long-lasting, and they produce a lengthy tail of mental health effects. Planning for the mental health effects of war and other disasters is critical for places of work and healthcare systems and nations. Much of what we know about the impact of trauma actually comes from our study of disasters, including those that are natural or climate-related, as well as human-generated. Disasters that are deliberate in nature, like war and other forms of intentional violence, often result in some of the most severe and adverse outcomes. And the war in Ukraine, like many disasters, is often not just a single event, but the collision of multiple disasters that add to the burden of stress for communities. And they complicate efforts at response and recovery. War can result in injury and death, but also damaged infrastructure and economic disruption and other national challenges and tragedies that have happened. It can be helpful to think about various dimensions of different disasters and what can be learned from each to better understand the impacts and the challenges, resources, and interventions. For instance, there are similarities to the experiences of being at war and working and living through a global pandemic, like prolonged stress and uncertainty, how they alter our sense of safety, the profound disruption that they cause throughout a society, and the vastness of exposure to death and dying. But there are also some very important differences, such as the intentional nature of the harm that's done, the devastation of community infrastructure that happens to war, and the extent to which these events either bring communities together or pull them apart. Understanding the differences and similarities between disasters can help with planning, as well as caring for our patients and ourselves. This graphic's not meant to be a perfect illustration of the experience of the war in Ukraine, but it should help to sort of reinforce the idea that I mentioned earlier, that whether it's a war or an earthquake, an industrial accident, or a global pandemic, these psychological and behavioral impacts are the most far-reaching and are likely to last the longest. And if history's any predictor, long after the physical injuries are healed, the experience of living through the exposures of war is likely to produce a lengthy tail of mental health effects and needs that can last for many, many years. So planning for these long-term needs can help healthcare providers and systems to more effectively protect the health of communities now and in the future. When we think about mental health and disasters, we often think about psychiatric disorders like PTSD. And in fact, PTSD is perhaps what's best known about disasters. These are important, and we have good treatments for disorders. But there are other outcomes of concern that we don't think about or talk about as often that are much more common than disorders, and they cause significant public mental health burden for individuals and all of a society. These include things like distress reactions, like insomnia or a decreased sense of safety, as well as risky health behaviors like substance use and others. We can think about the example of alcohol use, which increases after nearly every disaster. But whether or not someone has alcohol use disorder, the increased use of alcohol alone is associated with higher rates of interpersonal violence, work problems, and accidents. These early responses that happen long before psychiatric disorders occur cause significant problems at home and work, and they increase the risk for negative long-term outcomes. But it's also good to remember that many people, including those that are having difficulties during a disaster, can find ways to recover. Some people even end up feeling more confident in their ability to manage future stressors at some point. And finding ways to grow through adversity helps to build a sense of hope in difficult times. Part of sustaining communities is ensuring that families are cared for. So it's important to remember that children can show distress differently than adults and in ways that can be easily misinterpreted as misbehavior. It's particularly easy for parents to overlook these signs of distress because so many of them are dealing with the crisis of living through war, perhaps wondering if they will have food to eat or electricity to keep from freezing. So it's understandable that parents need help to see their children's abnormal behavior not as willful acting out or troublemaking, but as a call for help. For instance, younger children may revert to earlier childhood behaviors like loss of toileting or needing to be closer to or clinging on to caregivers, while older children might isolate themselves or become more aggressive. These are usually a sign that children need help and support, not discipline. When parents respond to these behaviors with compassion and caring and understanding, it can help children to feel safe and connected, and these things will protect their mental and physical health. Educating families on the different ways that children and adolescents can show distress can help them to respond more effectively, and encouraging caregivers to reestablish some type of routines for children and doing things to take care of themselves as the caregivers can also help protect the mental health of children and adolescents in war and in other disasters. It's helpful to remember that the stress people experience in any disaster occurs on a continuum. Whether someone is a civilian or a soldier living through the war, a healthcare worker on the front lines of a global pandemic, a family dealing with the aftermath of an earthquake. Protecting mental health, fostering resilience, and helping people to function and do the basic things that they need to do are all heavily influenced by support from peers and organizations and leaders. On the extreme end of the continuum is mental illness. And when that occurs, people are more likely to benefit from medications and psychotherapy. But we want to remember that not everyone who feels sad or angry or worried needs an antidepressant. In fact, as we're working with people who are experiencing distress, it's good to remind them that it's normal to feel sad or angry, to have trouble sleeping or feel tired a lot. Sometimes when people experience these things, they might feel like they're going crazy or they're losing their mind. When people know that what's happening to them is normal and expected, it can help them to feel a little calmer. And finding ways to feel calm during high stress events protects their physical and mental health. The effects of war, like many disasters, unfold over time. After disasters like a tsunami or an earthquake, or even during a war, and particularly the early stages, there's often a coming together where the community feels a bonding and connection over a shared adversity. Most of the media reporting about the experience of Ukrainians generally portrays a strong sense of unity within communities, and this can be very protective. Though for people displaced from their communities or whose friends or loved ones have been killed, there may be a loss in a sense of connection. And even when communities have strong connections, in most disasters, eventually a sense of disillusionment will set in. And this can diminish that feeling of togetherness among community members, and it can increase risk for mental health problems. In any disaster, it's helpful to anticipate these changes over time, where an early sense of cohesion and coming together gives way to more negative feelings and a sense of disconnectedness or even despair. Reminding patients and even community leaders and ourselves that these are normal phases and taking steps to support people going through these challenges can help to foster resilience and recovery. It's important to remember that risk and resilience aren't static, but they're influenced by time and context. So knowing the who, what, when, and where help us better understand how to foster and sustain resilience. This is helpful to consider when working with individuals and communities. Understanding these aspects of risk and resilience can help to better identify where risk is concentrated, how it's changing over time, and what factors are protecting people. This becomes important in developing interventions and allocating resources. We can think of stressors almost like a toxin, like lead or radiation. And to understand risk and intervene effectively, we need to understand aspects of exposure. Those things I mentioned, who, when, how much, the response over time, as well as factors that buffer against it. Social support is one of the most significant protective factors in disasters, but it can be significantly diminished for people who are separated from their homes or communities, or people close to them relocate or die. For organizations like maybe a healthcare community or a military unit, team cohesion, that connection between people and a feeling of a shared experience, that's very protective as well. When people feel like they are united in accomplishing a common goal. Exposure to human remains and mass death can increase risk for mental health problems, particularly when people experience what we call psychological identification. This is where a person sees human remains and begins to think, that could be me, or that could be my loved one. Guilt or shame also increase risk, which might be present for people who feel they failed to protect their loved ones or left people behind. The experience of bereavement from the death of a loved one, particularly a traumatic death, increases risk for a variety of adverse mental health effects, including psychiatric disorders and even suicide. In war, sexual violence is a tool that enemy forces use to control, manipulate, and instill fear. And this type of violence is associated with particularly high levels of distress, as well as psychiatric disorders. It's also important to remember that these risks will change over time. For instance, bullets and rockets will kill and maim people throughout the war, but occasionally there have been increasing threats about the specter of the use of nuclear weapons, which create their own type of fear response in populations, whether or not those weapons are used or not. And as the war goes on, there's growing attention and awareness to the issue of traumatic brain injury after blast explosions. So the challenges and risks change as the disaster evolves. If you're part of a healthcare organization or other system, creating a framework to help understand where risk is concentrated and how it's evolving over time during the war can be helpful for planning. This is a Haddon matrix, which is a risk management tool, and it helps an organization to consider various aspects of a disaster across time. It's particularly helpful for doing something that's often especially difficult during a disaster, and that's thinking beyond the present moment. When someone looks at this picture from Ukraine, they might see a vulnerable older adult grieving the loss of their home. Or they might see a defiant, experienced community member with the grit and resilience to persevere through an extraordinary life adversity. Both of those stories could be true. It's important to be aware of our assumptions about risk. It's good to ask people about how they're finding their way and the things they've done that have been helpful. Then you can reflect back to them on the positive steps they've taken to care for themselves, their families, their communities during such a difficult time. This reminds people of their own inherent capabilities, and it promotes a sense of self and community efficacy, which are very protective during war. If you're able to do any ongoing health surveillance within a community, assessing over time for various risk and protective factors, this can help care providers to better understand changing aspects of risk, which allows you to more effectively focus resources on people and places that need it most. Treating psychiatric disorders is one aspect of addressing mental health and disasters, and it's important. But I'm not going to spend much time talking about treatment for mental health conditions, because that's something with which many of you are likely to be reasonably familiar, or at least know where to look up that information if you need it. Something many physicians and other healthcare providers are less familiar with are the principles and the essential elements that reduce distress and protect mental health during war and other disasters. I'm going to spend time briefly reviewing these principles and then talk about specific situations that often arise when working with people affected by war, as well as actions you can use to apply these principles that can help to lower people's distress, to protect mental health, and to foster resilience for folks, as well as to help people to more effectively participate in interventions for their broader healthcare needs. In disasters, we can reduce distress and improve functioning through interventions that foster 5 essential elements. These include enhancing a sense of safety, calming, efficacy, social connectedness, and hope. These 5 elements form the basis of what's been called psychological first aid, which is an evidence-based framework for delivering interventions to support resilience in individuals, communities, and organizations. I'll very briefly highlight a few examples of research we've done to better understand these 5 essential elements in different types of disasters, and then talk more about some practical actions that you can use. We can think about one of these elements, community collective efficacy, which is a measure of community strength. Following the devastating 2004 and 2005 hurricane season in the state of Florida in the United States, our study of over 2,000 disaster workers found that workers who indicated living in stronger communities reported lower symptoms of post-traumatic stress. What's even more striking is that higher levels of community strength actually buffered against the risk of personal injury from the storm, such that even those who had high injury had very low risk of post-traumatic stress symptoms, and the risk was almost indistinguishable from those who had low injury. So strong communities are protective during a disaster. Another essential element is safety. It's good to be safe. It's also important to feel safe, which also protects our health. We studied several thousand community members shortly after the 2002 terrorist sniper shootings in Washington, D.C. in the United States. And we found that people who reported feeling safer had better sleep, drank less alcohol, used less tobacco, and had lower rates of depression and post-traumatic stress. So feeling safe is very important for our health. It's good to think about people's mental health in disasters. Of course, if people have psychiatric disorders, they may need medications or psychotherapy, and those are good to have available and be able to provide them. But most people that see a healthcare provider will have other basic things on their mind. And it's difficult to talk about feeling sad when you don't know if you'll have food to eat or you're worried your bubble will freeze at night. One of the most important things healthcare providers can do is to have information on where their patients can find basic resources within the community. Maybe you have a medical technician, a nurse, a social worker who can help find these resources and help patients get connected and stay connected with them. Helping people to meet basic and practical needs is one of the most significant actions you can take to help protect their mental health. The military combat and operational stress control model can offer a framework for approaching individuals in distress during war. This COSC model focuses first and foremost on basic, simple interventions for people experiencing distress, like improving sleep and nutrition and exercise. It also emphasizes keeping people close to their support systems within the community whenever possible, rather than moving them away to places like hospitals. It also reminds people that it's normal to have stress reactions and that these may come and go over time, but also provide education about what to be on the lookout for, like if people start drinking too much or getting into fights with their spouse, and let them know where to go and what to do if things get worse. The simple PIES approach is an important aspect of fostering wellness and enhancing the ability to function in high stress situations without medicalizing the experiences that people are having. And this is critical because many people are unlikely to seek mental health care, or they'll only do so once things have gotten really bad. They might feel that seeking mental health care means they're weak or there's something wrong with them. This is particularly the case in certain communities and professions like healthcare workers, military service members, first responders and emergency workers, and other communities that have a culture of caring for other people's needs above their own. And in many communities, seeking help still comes with a feeling of stigma, whether that's an internal perception that it's not okay to ask for help, or as well as concerns about what other people will think of them. So in order to reach people and be able to address distress reactions and risk behaviors early, it helps to have simple, approachable interventions that lower barriers at the earliest possible time and address some of these early responses. So now I'll talk about a few common challenges for communities experiencing war and other disasters and ways that you can help patients with these difficulties. Acute stress response can occur for soldiers and family members during exposure to war and combat. And it can also happen to healthcare workers exposed to extremes of suffering and death. Acute stress response can manifest as withdrawal and disconnection, or anger and agitation. A person may seem disoriented or not able to respond when you try to communicate with them. Acute stress response leaves someone unable to function or engage in protective health behaviors. Helping someone calm an acute stress response can aid that person in recovering the ability to function and protect the health and safety of those around them. It can also foster a sense of efficacy in the helper by reminding them of ways they can support others, even when a situation seems overwhelming. Helping people to feel calm is important. Being calm allows us to think more clearly and make safer decisions. Whenever possible, it's good to ask people, how have you calmed in the past, rather than trying to teach new techniques, because learning is very difficult when our brain is under significant stress. If the person has family or social support, these can be helpful as well. Remind patients trying to care for their loved ones that it can help to feel calm when we sit next to someone we care about, like a spouse, child, or friend, and hug them or hold hands together. Sometimes a patient may be experiencing acute stress and need your help. Ask if you can sit next to them. If it seems appropriate, offer to hold their hand. Tell them we will breathe in and out together. This will help them to feel calm, and it will also help you to feel calm. Both are good. Do the same with children as you would do with an adult. Grounding techniques are another simple way to feel calm. Ask someone to sit up and feel their feet on the floor. Tell them, find where you are solid and feel yourself there on the ground. An important way to help people feel calmer and safer is to lower exposure to disaster-related media. Starting after the plane crash of 9/11, all the way through the COVID-19 pandemic, work has been done to better understand how disaster-related media impacts well-being. People who consume and view more media during disasters feel more unsafe. They tend to use more alcohol and tobacco, also to have more symptoms of depression and post-traumatic stress, and to get less sleep, all of which diminish well-being and they impair functioning and decision-making. Using public health education campaigns and role modeling by healthcare providers and community leaders can encourage people to protect themselves by using media wisely, and reminding people, as difficult as it can feel sometimes, that it's good for our health to take regular media breaks. When neighborhoods and cities are disrupted due to death or displacement, finding ways to feel connected and part of a community is important. Feeling connected to others and a belief that one has a strong social support system is one of the most significant predictors of resilience during disasters like war and others. Connecting people with other individuals and groups who have a shared experience helps people, like your patients, to feel that they're part of something bigger than themselves, and it can remind them of their strengths. Feeling that we're connected and a part of things is always helpful and very protective in war and other disasters. When supporting a child affected by a disaster, it's helpful to remember and remind caregivers the three things to be. Be calm when engaging them, be clear when speaking to them, and be with them. While this may seem obvious, the idea of being with children is important to remember because caregivers who are distracted and feeling significant stress can easily forget that time with children, being physically present, holding them, playing with them, these help children to feel calm and safe and connected, which are all protective. Also, remind caregivers that children, like adults, may or may not want to talk about their experiences. Often the best way to understand what's happening for them is to be with them in usual activities, like throwing a ball or playing with dolls or going for a walk. Children often reveal their concerns during these times together. Caregivers have many, many concerns and can believe that children carry the same concerns, but often this is not the case. Caregivers may be concerned about finding food, if they'll have electricity at night, or whether they'll ever see their spouse again. Children may be wondering if they'll get to go back to school and play a favorite game with friends. So it's important that we listen to the questions children ask and answer only what they're asking, and not overwhelm them with information or adult worries. And in a similar way, it's important to help caregivers find other adults with whom to share their worries. Perhaps they can share them with you. But ongoing exposure to grown-up worries can be very troubling for children. Anything to help support parents and other caregivers of children, teaching them ways to manage stress, caring for their own health and well-being. These ultimately help to support children. In war, there are 3 particularly difficult emotions that are common, and they're emotions we can all struggle with at times: anger, shame, and sadness. We learn to manage these emotions for ourselves, and it's important to listen to others when they need to express them. When someone's angry, it's okay to say, yes, I feel that too, or just to listen. When people show sadness, likewise, if it's true for you, we can say, I'm also sad. When people express shame in particular, do not move away from it. It's important to be with them and let them speak. We don't have to agree or disagree. Just being present and not pulling away helps keep people from feeling alone, and this is important for healing. For many of us as care providers, we're trained to keep our feelings to ourselves. Being a human being, showing kindness and caring, listening without judgment or a need to fix or correct people. These can be very powerful in helping others begin to heal, and sometimes helping ourselves begin to heal. Trouble with sleeping is very common during war and other disasters. If there's one symptom or aspect of physiology that is important to address, it's sleep. Worry about safety, being in transient and unfamiliar housing, uncomfortable environments, and noise can all make sleep difficult. Even short-term sleep difficulties can impair our ability to make decisions that protect ourselves and our families, that will reduce our ability to respond to threats and even weaken our immune system. When sleep deprivation becomes severe, it can cause people to experience things like delirium or other symptoms that mimic psychiatric disorders like anxiety, depression, or mania, or psychosis. While it may be unrealistic to expect optimal sleep during times of war, there are actions to do and some to avoid that can improve sleep. Whenever possible, for instance, encourage people to go to bed and get up at the same time. Avoid using electronic devices while in bed. Wear earplugs or use other devices to mask background noises, and avoid using caffeine or alcohol within 6 hours of bedtime. These are some of the practices commonly referred to as sleep hygiene, and they are some of the actions that are effective in improving sleep. Also, remind adult patients that improving sleep will help them make healthier and safer decisions for their families. It can help to have a basic set of principles to consider when thinking about whether someone is doing okay during a disaster. For instance, we might think that someone's having a serious problem because they have emotional outbursts, but strong expressions of emotion are normal during extreme stress events. A more useful question is whether the person can manage and control these emotions, whether those intense emotions are intermittent or becoming the norm. Similarly, it's common to feel sad and disconnected sometimes during war. A person might need time off on their own, maybe more than usual, and this might lead us to think that there's something wrong with them. But if they're able to still feel things and maintain a sense of connection to others, this is probably a good indicator that they're doing okay for now. These 4 basic questions that I've put up here can help to guide your approach to identifying those who need additional contact, support, and follow-up. You may be going through the same experiences as your patients during this war, and needing to take care of patients while also managing the extreme difficulties of war can create unique stress for care providers. Protecting the well-being of healthcare workers is critical, and it's easily overlooked in war and other disasters. We talked about applying the 5 essential elements to lower distress and foster resilience in patients. These same principles can be applied to help protect workers who are caring for communities impacted by war and other disasters. Whether we're thinking about fostering resilience in patients, sustaining a military unit in combat, or protecting healthcare professionals caring for all these individuals, there are multiple factors to consider. I'll briefly highlight a few practices that can also protect healthcare workers and their teams during war, many of which are adapted from various high-risk occupations. These practices involve actions not just by individuals, but also by peers. Asking for help can be difficult, particularly for healthcare workers, military personnel, and other people who work in professions that are devoted to the care and safety of others, sometimes at the expense of their own well-being. Buddy systems have been around a long time. Healthcare teams and systems around the world began adopting buddy systems during the global pandemic to protect healthcare workers and found that it was helpful. Militaries across the globe have used buddy systems for a long time to protect service members in combat and other operations. Buddies check in with each other regularly. They provide support and camaraderie, and they encourage self-care. This type of formal rather than ad hoc peer support is particularly helpful in organizations where workers have difficulty asking for help. It's good to identify a buddy that you can check in with who is also willing to check in with you regularly. Buddies might check in during work to see how the other one's doing and encourage them to take a break when needed. Make sure they have something to eat and practice other self-care. They might go out after work to talk about their day and have a beer, but also remind each other that it's good to have just one beer. Having a peer buddy reminds us there's someone that we can help who's also looking out for us. And that can be very protective during a war and other disasters. You or a colleague might be intensely focused on caring for patients for days or weeks at a time, and then abruptly transition to more routine work. Certainly this happens for military personnel. It's easy to think of leaving the front lines of any intense activity, whether it's the war or the COVID-19 pandemic, as a good thing. But reintegration, which is the process of going back to normal daily life after prolonged exposure to extremes of stress, can actually be very disruptive. Reintegration requires people to dial down a mindset of being in the hot zone as they return to more day-to-day activities. Sometimes people feel a loss of meaning in their regular daily work, or a sense that others don't understand what they experienced, which might leave them feeling isolated from friends and loved ones. Reintegration challenges are common after exposure to war and pandemics and other extremely stressful events for soldiers and healthcare workers, as well as their families who may not understand what's happening to their loved one. Anticipating and planning for reintegration challenges, providing education to people and their families about normal reintegration challenges as they prepare to come out of the hot zone, and supporting those who are having difficulties during the reintegration period can reduce stress, enhance functioning, and improve recovery time. The U.S. military developed an education resource on reintegration for soldiers called BattleMind, and have provided images and links to the resource on this slide. While it's primarily focused on military service members returning from combat, because so much of Ukraine is on the front lines of war, you may find some of these principles and practices helpful to keep in mind for protecting your own well-being. You may be a leader, work with leaders, or communicate with leaders in your community. What leaders do and say during times of crisis has an impact not only on the well-being of community members, but the trajectory of recovery for the entire community. And leaders exist at many levels, including team leaders, office managers, charge nurses, and others. Being present, leading by example, communicating regularly and truthfully, fighting for the things your people need, and ensuring people get help when needed are some of the leadership behaviors that engender trust and help to sustain a workforce. It's also helpful to think about practical actions for leaders to protect their teams. We were asked by the U.S. National Guard to assess military service members who worked extremely intense COVID-19 operations. And our sample of nearly 4,000 personnel revealed that praising people when they did good work and reminding people of the value of the work they were doing were strongly associated with higher levels of perceived leadership support. And that leadership support was protective of physical and mental health. People who perceived that they had strong and supportive leaders slept better, had better mental health, and had better physical health. So whether it's during a pandemic, war, or any disaster, these are helpful leadership actions to protect mental health and foster resilience, reminding people of the good work that they're doing and the importance and the value of that work. Grief is a near universal aspect of disasters and one that is often overlooked. The term grief leadership was coined by Dr. Colonel Larry Ingram from the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research following the U.S. military air disaster in Gander, Newfoundland that happened in 1985 that killed all 248 soldiers as well as the crew on board the aircraft. This was the deadliest peacetime military air disaster in US history. Communities in which grief leadership was utilized recovered more quickly. Effective grief leadership fosters healing and recovery through genuine and ongoing communication, being present with people, openly acknowledging losses, facilitating processes that honor these losses, helping to make meaning of the event, and ultimately finding ways to look hopefully to the future. For healthcare workers and their patients, soldiers, and families living through a war, sustaining a sense of hope while acknowledging and addressing the challenges of the day is a difficult task. Hope certainly isn't about being Pollyanna or pretending that problems don't exist. Rear Admiral James Stockdale was a US Navy fighter pilot during the Vietnam War. And he spent 7.5 years in a prisoner of war camp known as the Hanoi Hilton after his plane was shot down. In a book written about him, Rear Admiral Stockdale described the tension between the ideas of sustaining a sense of hope while acknowledging and addressing the sometimes brutal reality that's in front of us. In truth, both of these are critical in our ability to persevere through a prolonged crisis, to sustain a vision of a better tomorrow, and perhaps to emerge even stronger. Sometimes when stress is high and we can't remember all the things we've learned about how to protect ourselves and those around us, it can be helpful to have a very simple approach to recall, to support patients, to support ourselves. So you can try PMVC. P is for phone. We spend a lot of time staring at our cell phones often, so take a break and put it down. M is for media, which often has information that raises our stress level rather than lower it. Dial down your stress by turning off media for a bit. V is for vision. Most of us spend a lot of time looking at things that are right in front of us, and this narrows our vision, not just with our eyes, but also our mind. This makes it more difficult to think beyond the present moment. So look out the window, or better yet, step outside if you can, and it's safe to do so for a few minutes, and give yourself some horizon therapy by looking at something off in the distance. This changes what we see and how we think, and it can actually improve our ability to solve problems and expand our thinking. And C is for connect. Reach out and connect with someone, preferably someone you haven't connected with in a while, maybe even someone you think could really use a connection right now.